Welcome to another exciting episode of our Cutting Edge podcast. I've got an amazing co-host with me. Co-host, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Geoffrey. I'm a PhD candidate in the School of Media and Communications at the University of Sydney. And my research is looking at game live streaming and how it develops different types of humor and jokes across social media platforms.
Too easy, as they say. And we've got our featured guest of this episode. Featured guest, can you please introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm John Cook. I'm a cognitive scientist at the University of Melbourne. I research countering misinformation, but as a former cartoonist, one thing I've been doing a lot of lately is bringing humor into my research as a tool for neutralizing misinformation.
Super interesting. And this is just where we get going. So please hold on tight as we get going with our first question. So first question, I have it. Logic-based inoculation has been a cornerstone of your work in combination in combating misinformation. Can you explain how all of this works? How do you combat misinformation with logic-based inoculation? How does that work?
Well, firstly, to explain inoculation, this is a branch of psychological research that takes the idea of vaccination, where we expose people to a weakened version of a virus to build up their immunity so that when they encounter the real virus, they don't get infected. In psychology, we find that if you expose people to a weakened version of misinformation, that builds up their cognitive immunity so that when they encounter real misinformation, they're less likely to be misinformed or misled. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can build an inoculation, but the main way that I've been working on it has been through logic-based inoculation, which is weakening the misinformation or helping people see through the misinformation by explaining the logical fallacies or the rhetorical techniques used to mislead. In other words, explaining the magician's trick.
Brilliant, and very succinctly formulated. And if I could properly read the first question, even better for it. But I promise that Geoffrey can properly read the second question. Geoffrey, over to you then.
Yeah, well, the pressure's on me now. But
performing. Go ahead.
Yeah, John. So you said, your research has shown that humorous debunking can increase engagement and help combat misinformation on platforms like Twitter and Instagram. Based on your findings, can you explain why humor seems to make such a difference here?
So humor does a couple of different things that makes it especially good for science communication and countering misinformation. Firstly, it grabs people's attention, kind of a first step you really need if you want to try to communicate information to people. And given how the attention economy is so hard these days.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, humor helps people pay more attention. Once you've got their attention, you can hold it for longer. And we've done research that has found that it does hold attention longer than non-humorous. And one of the reasons for this is because when people are reading something that they know is humorous, they're willing to put the effort into it because they anticipate there's going to be a payoff. There's going to be a punchline at the end. They're going to be rewarded. So cognitively, psychologically, they're willing to put more effort into paying attention to something. Third, humor lowers people's defenses. So if it's something that might be challenging, like a topic like climate change, it does make them more open to the topic. And lastly, in the case of misinformation, humor can help you make abstract logic more concrete or relatable or understandable through techniques like parallel argumentation, which is a very jargony term, but it's basically using logic analogies.
And John, you're with humor studies people, so we're all over the jargony stuff. Why not? Why not? Which actually gets me to the next question that we've got for here. So humor, and we've already touched upon this. So it has played a significant role in your work. So especially in your Cranky Uncle outputs. What can you tell us about Cranky Uncle, and how do you think humor can be an effective tool in debunking misinformation? So particularly in the role of that social media play nowadays.
The way I got into humor with my research was I was doing a lot of psychological research. I was digging deeper and deeper into this logic-based inoculation and explaining logical fallacies in misinformation. And then I was introduced by some critical thinking philosophers to this approach of parallel argumentation as a really accessible way to explain fallacies. The way it works is you take the flawed logic in some misinformation and you transplant it into a parallel situation that's the more extreme and absurd it is, the better. And it's a way to make the original flawed logic more obvious. So I'll give you a climate example. A common climate myth is arguing that cold weather disproves global warming. You often hear on a cold day.
Oh, God.
Just had the conversation with my granddad. You can't refute that, of course. Yeah.
Well, you can, and one way to refute it is through parallel argumentation. So you take that logic, cold weather disproves global warming, transplant it into a parallel situation. For example, it's nighttime, and someone argues, well, nighttime disproves the sun. What it's doing is taking that same logic, which is anecdotal thinking, only looking at your immediate circumstance, the time and place where you're at, and then generalizing that to the whole world. It doesn't work with global warming and cold weather. It also, just because it's night, doesn't mean that the sun has ceased to exist. Just means that where you are, the sun isn't shining. So it's an elegant and often humorous way to explain logical fallacies.
But I think that's fantastic. I need to apply that when he tells me my job is useless as an academic. I love that. And just looking at the time, you might actually then take us straight into the next question, Geoffrey, if you'd like.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of going back to the first question and your discussion about inoculation and drawing on vaccines. You've also worked with UNICEF on a really big problem that is vaccine misinformation and combating it with humour. What can you tell us about that project?
So the way that I've applied my humour research was taking that approach of parallel arguments and gamifying it. The idea being you show people examples of misinformation, humorous cartoon examples, and then you get them practicing critical thinking by showing them lots of examples, and they have to spot which fallacy is in the cartoon example. And we did this originally as a climate game, Cranky Uncle, and then UNICEF approached us and said, well, because this is critical thinking, this can translate easily to other topics. So can we do a vaccine version of the game? So we collaborated with UNICEF and the Sabin Vaccine Institute and developed Cranky Uncle Vaccine, which tackles vaccine misinformation in the same way.
I mean, just if we can just stick with this for a moment longer, did you ever think that UNICEF, like that this organization would reach out to you about something called Cranky Uncle? Like, how did it happen? Can you maybe tell us a bit more about that? I'd be super interested to hear just a bit more about how, did it all happen?
It is a bit out of left field, and you guys would probably be relate to this. Like using humor, using cartoons is a bit unconventional for academics. And so often when I explain what I do to academics, they have trouble getting their heads around it. But UNICEF, I think, have a more pragmatic approach. They were looking for an intervention that was practically ready to go off the shelf. And because we had Cranky Uncle already done, and it just needed to be adapted to the vaccine topic, that's what got them interested in it. But I also give a lot of credit to Angus Thompson, who was at the time he was working at UNICEF, and he also does a lot of work on vaccine misinformation. And he was the one who really championed Cranky Uncle as something that UNICEF could use. Took him a while. The wheels move slowly in a big organization like UNICEF, but we got there eventually.
Right. I mean, would you just, because a lot of people listening to this might also be early career people or senior people, but if, an early career researcher in your field came up to you and said, hey, I'd like to do this like game structure kind of approach, what would you tell them? Is it, something you think pays off? Is it sustainable?
As in using games?
For your research, because as you said, sometimes explaining to colleagues or, academics how humor works or how these things work is sometimes, not that they're not taking it seriously, but sometimes it's not as an easy sell. As you were saying, the UNICEF, they see it shelf ready and they are willing to take this. So what would you tell other people?
My general approach, well, my first principle is follow the evidence. And I didn't get into humor because my origin was humor, even though it was like being a cartoonist before I became a scientist. I got into it because the psychological research I was doing kept nudging me in that direction and pointing me towards the benefits of that approach. And eventually the data won me over. So that was the first thing. As for the doing unconventional work, on the one hand, there is more friction doing it that way, because if you're doing something that people haven't seen before, it is difficult for them to understand. On the other hand, if you can get over that hurdle, it's the original work that people haven't seen before that often gets traction. And so I would definitely, if you have something that's evidence-based and original, I would champion it and try to take it as far as you can get, and you never know where it might go.
I could talk about this for hours, and if, I guess people want to reach out to you and be informed, they will find all the information in the show notes and everything there. But we've got one question left. So Geoffrey, over to you. We've got a couple of minutes for it.
Yeah. So final question, and sort of in this sense of unexpected and these new things. What are some of the most surprising or unexpected findings you've come across in your research area, and especially while working on humour?
This isn't a finding from my research, but one thing that jumped out at me was, when we were doing our critical thinking research, this was the work I did with the philosophers who introduced me to this approach of parallel argumentation. The thing that jumped out at me was that this was a technique that late night comedians used every night. And I didn't even realize that was what they were doing until the philosophers explained this communication technique. They would often debunk some misinformation that a public figure said that day. And the way they would do it is they don't go into a big, long explanation of all the facts and so on, unless it's John Oliver. But instead, what they would do is they would say, well, this public figure said this. Well, that's just like being in this situation. And then they use the same logic. The audience laughs, it's entertaining, but it also punctures the original flawed logic in the misinformation. So I realized that parallel arguments were a really powerful way to entertain audiences while educating them, and in a way that very elegantly could sidestep or navigate complicated issues.
I mean, and Geoffrey, because of your own research there, and I'm just trying to kind of connect the dots there also with my research, because I'm really, really, really interested in this idea of what you just said, elegantly sidestepping. So because sometimes it is necessary to think a bit outside the box there with our research, and particularly with humor. So what's next? What do you have planned next when it comes to humor and using it for these unexpected findings? Or I love that phrase, elegantly sidestepping these kind of barriers. What's coming on?
We're looking a lot into AI. Given that AI is turbocharging the spread of misinformation, it's almost necessary to use AI to counter it, because it's just spreading so quickly and broadly. So we're using AI to detect and then write debunkings of misinformation, as including explaining the fallacies. So doing logic-based inoculation with AI. So that's a lot of what we haven't looked into, the humor part of it, and large language models are notoriously bad at humor. They
well, I'd imagine it'd be quite funny to read some of their responses.
I've dabbled with asking AI to generate parallel argument analogies, and it was dodgy. So we're not quite ready to go down that road, but we're just making the more serious or non-humorous AI debunkings our first research focus. If we can get on top of that, then we might start looking at more creative approaches.
Well, no, that sounds amazing, and perfect timing. We're almost out of it. So, thanks so much, John, for being here. Thanks, Geoffrey, for co-hosting this episode. For all of you out there listening, please follow us. We've got again more episodes coming up, or you'd like to listen to some of the past episodes. It's all out there. Follow the HSCN, and thanks for listening, and thanks for being here, John and Geoffrey.